Hi guys, Tim here from Play Tennis Singapore. This is a short video to talk a little bit about strings, how they feel different and how they affect the way your tennis racket plays. It's something that not many people know a lot about, but I think tennis string is very important. It's a very crucial part in how your racket plays. Now there's just 5 things I want to talk about regarding strings. I'm going to talk a little bit about string tension, which I already mentioned in a previous video on how to choose a tennis racket, but I'll touch on that again. I'm also going to talk about the types of strings. I'm going to talk about string texture, string tension, and string gauge, which is how thick the string is. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is string pattern. Now you have a few common types of string patterns that we see quite a fair bit in the industry. You have patterns such as 16 by 18, a more open string pattern. You have 16 by 19, which is what this racket is, and you have 18 by 20, which is this Wilson blade here. Okay, so it's as simple as this. The less strings there are, the more spin friendly the racket is, and the more strings there are, the more control oriented that racket is. So essentially with less strings you have more open squares on the surface of the string bed, which means that the ball grips into the string bed, which produces more spin and more power as well, but obviously less control. Now with more strings, a tighter string pattern such as 18 by 20, these squares are noticeably smaller, which means you get more control, more ball pocketing, but less spin and slightly less power. Now, a really good compromise of different string patterns, 16 by 19. It's not too open and it's not too closed. Now, obviously not everyone is suited to certain string patterns and whatnot, but I found this a really good compromise, and that's why I made the switch from an 18 by 20 string pattern to 16 by 19 string pattern in this racket. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the types of strings that you can get. Now, it's quite a broad topic, but I'm going to try and keep it as fast as simple as possible. Now, the main type of string I want to talk about is a polyester string. There are other types, such as natural gut, which is fantastic to play with. It feels amazing, it's powerful, it has great feel and great touch. But the only downside is that it's extremely expensive. One set of string for one racket can cost in excess of $50. Now, for some people, they can afford that and it's worth it, but for most of the community, it's too expensive, especially because it's not that durable of a string, so you have to keep changing it. And yeah, like I said, it's just very expensive, but it does feel amazing. It is the only string, natural gut is the only string that is made from purely natural materials. I think it's made from cow intestines. Another type, which is more common, is synthetic gut. So it's a gut string that is produced synthetically, usually from nylon, and it's very commonly used, especially among beginners, players who don't value their specific technique as much, especially because they're just starting out or they're just playing social tennis. Synthetic gut is one of the cheapest forms of strings, really affordable, more power than a polyester string, which I'll touch on later, but ultimately not as durable. Now, for someone who is playing social tennis and doesn't really play that much, synthetic strings are great. They are very cost effective, they don't cost much at all, and if you don't play much, they're still not going to break that fast. Okay, now finally to touch on polyester strings. Now I have two different polyester strings in my rackets here. One in 16 gauge and one in 17 gauge. I'll touch on the gauges later. Okay, so a polyester string is probably one of the most common strings used around the world, even on the pro tour and amongst all tennis players around. Okay, so a polyester string is essentially in the middle of a natural gut and a synthetic gut. It's not too expensive, it's not extremely cheap, but it's definitely not too expensive. You can get polyester strings for cheap when they're on sale. Now the thing about a polyester string is they are durable. They are made to last, which means you're going to get less power, and they're going to feel a little bit more dead. Okay, so you're not going to get that pop, and you're not going to get that spring that you would feel in gut strings. However, these strings do last quite a while for an average player. You do get really good control with these strings, and like I said, for that reason, they are probably the most popular string out there in the world. Okay, so obviously different brands make different strings that feel differently. It all comes down to personal preference. I can recommend a couple of strings, such as the one I'm using now, which is Solinco Hyper G. Feels fantastic. It's more of a dead feel, which means it's very control oriented. You have to swing the racket to generate your power, but you get amazing control. The other string I use is also from Solinco. It's Solinco Tour Bite. This one is more lively. It feels slightly more powerful than the Hyper G. Still a control-oriented string, but I use this one because it's textured, which I'll touch on in a bit, for the tighter string pattern. Okay, so in terms of a string texture, which is the next thing I want to talk about. Different strings. So let's stay on polyester strings here. Different polyester strings from different brands and different companies can come textured or non-textured. Okay, so normal string, such as this Solinco Hyper G here, is mostly round. Okay, so it's a smooth string. Think of it as just a circle on the string. Now, this string in the Solinco Tour Bite is a textured string. This means that it's essentially shaped as such. Think of it as an octagon, that sort of shape, which means there are edges in the string. Now this simply means that you get a tiny bit more power, but mainly more spin. So the reason I had a textured or a shaped string in this racket is because it has a very tight string pattern. It has an 18 by 20 string pattern, which means that this string pattern doesn't really allow me to produce much spin. So I put a textured string in here to help me produce extra spin, compared to this 16 by 19 string pattern, which, because of the string pattern, already allows me to produce a lot of spin. I don't need that textured string, and I don't from my game style, I don't want to have too much spin. It's quite straightforward with textured strings. If you want more spin, go for a textured string. Go for a string that is shaped, which allows you to bite the ball and produce more spin. Okay, so next thing I want to talk, second to last thing I want to talk about, a string gauge. Now, string gauge simply refers to the thickness of the string. Gauges range from 15 to 19, I believe. Now, the smaller the number, the thicker the string, and obviously the larger the number, the thinner the string. Now, there are certain benefits, very simple. A thicker string produces more control, less spin, and less power. A thinner string produces more spin, a bit more power, and less control. It's as simple as, like I mentioned with the string pattern, how big the squares are in the surface area. The thinner the string is, the bigger the squares will be, which means the strings can bite onto that tennis ball. In terms of durability, the thicker the string, the more durable it is. For those big hitters who like to hit the ball hard, thicker string is the way to go, simply because when you hit the ball hard, that thicker string isn't going to break as much. Okay, so in my particular racket, 16 by 19 string pattern, for me it's an open string pattern, so I use a 16 gauge string. It's a 1.30 millimeter string, so it's nice and thick. I hit the ball nice and hard, and I don't have to change these strings every month. They last me at least a few months, which is perfect. In my old racket, 18 by 20, it has a more tight string pattern, which means that I needed to use a thinner string to compensate for that. Again, with the textured string as well. This Solinco Tour Bite, I used it in 17 gauge, which is 1.25 millimeters. Some brands, 1.25 millimeters is 16L, so you just have to be careful with the numbers they use, but the best thing is just to look at the millimeters in terms of how thick you want the string, okay? So I use a 1.25 millimeter string for this racket. The string is slightly thinner, means the squares are slightly larger, lets me produce spin, gives me a bit more power, okay? The last thing I want to talk about is the string tension. Now, a lot of people are unsure what this means, but it is quite important to how the racket plays. We've talked about, for about 10 minutes, we've talked about different types of strings and what these strings look like and how they play and whatnot. But it all goes out the window if you get the tension wrong, okay? So you've chosen your string, you've got your racket. Now, the person at the tennis shop or your tennis stringer asks you, what tension would you like? It's very important to know what tension you want because that affects the way you play. Now, it's as simple as this. The tighter the tension is, the more control you're going to get. The racket's going to feel very firm, and you're also going to get a lot of feedback on those off-center hits. Means when the ball hits off-center, you're going to feel it. You're going to have a very low-powered response. It's going to be less forgiving, but for some players, especially more advanced players, that's what you want. You want that feedback so that you don't do it again on the next shot. Okay. Now, with a lower string tension, which means the strings are looser, you're going to get more power, and it's going to have a more forgiving response again. So when it goes off center, you're not going to feel it as much. It's still going to be more powerful, and it's going to feel good, but you're not going to get that feedback. So it all comes down to personal preference and how you want the racket to play. Now, if you're unsure exactly what tension, it's as simple as looking at the recommendation on the racket itself. So for example, this racket, it says here for strings, 50 to 60 pounds, okay? So if you're unsure, what I do recommend is that you choose a tension slightly below the middle. So if this racket recommends 50 to 60 pounds, I would say 53 or 54 is perfect, okay? Let's say you wanted a tighter string pattern, you want to have that control and you want to have that feedback on those off-center hits, I would say go up to 57, maybe even 58 if you're feeling very brave, because it can be quite tough on your arm. Okay, so it's as simple as choosing strings and string patterns and string tensions that you feel comfortable with and that suit your game style, okay? So just to quickly recap, my recommendation is to go with a polyester string. Now, they're affordable, okay? They last a long time and they're very control oriented. If you want power, you can use those polyester strings. You can string the tension lower, you can have a lower tension, or you can get a thinner string. But keep in mind, with a thinner string, just because it's a polyester doesn't mean that it will still last a long time. If you get a very thin string, that string can still break early on because it's thin, okay? So ultimately, it all comes down to how you want your racket to feel. Do not be afraid to keep trying different strings. I reckon I've used at least 50 different strings in my lifetime, and it took me years to finally find the one string or the one brand that I'm super comfortable with, that I love playing with, which is Solinco Tour Bite and the Solinco Hyper G here. Okay, so I hope you learn from this video, and I hope that you can take into account all these factors and choose a string that you're comfortable with, and hopefully find a string that you can keep hitting with. Thanks.